in food.
Truth in Food is essentially the 30 years of travel I've gone all over the world and finding authenticity of where these products come from. And all the myths, all the things that you have thought about food, so many are untrue. And this show is about people, places, and things that have to do with the reality of what you're putting in your mouth.
Oh, that sounds
The food archaeologist, which I think is a good description. So under the guise and premise of the food archaeologist, John, why don't you introduce yourself and what would you tell people you actually do?
You know, I'm a food and beverage global expert. I would say my training in Switzerland in economics really showed me that there's scarce resources around the world and how to allocate those to the consumer. There is so much misinformation out there from a corporate standpoint, from what the governments are telling you. And so I pride myself on working with governments, traveling all over the world into Siberia, Tunisia, Sri Lanka, Africa, Mexico, China, looking for those foods that can be brought to the United States and brought around the world that are economical, that are good for the environment and tasty. So for me, it's really about eat, drink, and think at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I find
I'm going to take people on a journey, and it's a personal journey of people, places, and things describing the reality of what you're putting in your mouth and your brain. So when you think about it, the only thing that you really can control, can't control your genes, you can't control where you came from, you can close your eyes, but you don't want to live that way, is taking your two hands and what you put in your mouth. Think about that. That's really the only thing you can control, is what you take in your two hands and put in your mouth. And that is sacred. And you need to know what that is, because I guarantee you a lot of you aren't even thinking about that.
right. Exactly.
I have sold hundreds of products into some of the largest retailers on earth: Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, Walmart, distribution companies. I go around the world and find really the root of where food comes from. For instance, let's take vanilla. Vanilla is not from Madagascar.
From Manila.
And it's not from Manila, and it's not from Tahiti. But Tahitian vanilla sounds better than Mexican vanilla. Do you know that vanilla comes from one valley in Mexico, one city? It's called Papantla. And it's high up in the mountains, and vanilla is an orchid. And the vanilla bean is the stamina out of the flower of an orchid. That's what vanilla is. And for years and years and years, only a little fly could pollinate the orchid plants. They really didn't know how to do it. Someone discovered it, carted it off to Madagascar, cut thousands of acres and tens of thousands of acres of natural forest down to grow this vanilla. And it's wrong. Vanilla should come from Mexico. You don't need any water brought in. It's where naturally it grows. That's what a food archaeologist does. And I have hundreds of examples of where I find these things, from pine nuts in Russia, which it's not a nut, it's a seed. Okay. So all of these things we boil down into a wonderful edible product that's good for you, good for the environment, and it makes sense.
And how did you first?
Looking back into what the spark was, is it was just basic economics of working in Russia and realizing that I can get products out of there in the 90s for a lot less than when I sold it, I could make a really big profit.
And how did you end up in Russia?
You know, I went to school in Switzerland. I got a degree in economics from a standpoint of what's going to happen to a central planned economy and a capitalist economy. And it brought me to Russia in the early 90s, basically evaluating companies and seeing tremendous opportunity because all of these assets were controlled by the government. And so it was they were all nationalized. And so I was in the moment where these assets were becoming privatized. And that's where I thought, wow, this is an incredible opportunity. So I got into the vodka business early on.
Oh, okay.
And from that, it morphed into food from Russia. And then I started seeing, geez, there's opportunity all over the world from this. But initially, Russia was the biggest opportunity.
Oh, okay.
When we talk about being a food archaeologist, I mean, that's really what you've made a living of, is discovering these unique products around the world, learning the history of them, and help them bringing to the United States. And it's not just Russia. I know you're spending more time in China, but I'm also fascinated. I know you've done a lot of work. I think it started through the Vatican, but in Mexico, and I've heard some of the stories about the avocados. So share with me the avocados. We're going to move forward to one of my favorite stories, and that'll help transition us into the technology side.
You know, the avocado was actually, they know genetically it was born on a slope near a city called Uruapan in Mexico. So when people think of an avocado, you know, they're now grown all over the world, but you naturally want to eat a product where it's genetically from. It does not need any water. It does not need any fertilizer. All the avocados in California needs enormous amount of pumped in water that requires electricity. People don't understand that over 40% of the power in the state of California is used to pump water around the state.
Yeah.
We live in a desert. So why should we be buying avocados from California when they should not naturally be growing here? So also, an avocado is filled with fat. So you hear this word fat. Fat is not a bad thing. It is if it's artificial fat, if it's fat that is made up in a lab. But this complex fat from an avocado is actually very, very good for you. And, you know, there's a lot of avocado toast now being sold all over the place, which has caused the price of avocados to go up. And I've now seen a lot coming from Chile, and a lot coming, and unfortunately they're gassed and they're frozen. And that's a whole nother issue and a problem is, yes, you can have a clean avocado, but if it's been gassed, that's not necessarily a good thing for you. And I know you don't realize probably avocados that you're eating have been gassed.
Yeah. Let's go back. You said something interesting, which is the environmental impact of avocados, which to me is an interesting position, which leads to one of my other favorite stories, which is what I call your eco shock tuna.
Yeah.
Now that I call it the eco shock because I think it's cool and fascinating, but talk about the tuna in Sri Lanka and what's being done differently, and then we're going to move into how food security, whether it's avocados or fish, starts impacting technology. But I think the Sri Lanka tuna is fascinating.
So Sri Lanka is an island off the southern coast of Italy, and it was geologically separated millions and millions of years ago. So the flora and fauna of that island developed into very unique things that are found nowhere else in the world, such as cinnamon, such as pepper. What the Ayurvedic nature of the island, which is a way of healing, which is a way of taking the different spices and the cloves and the different things, adding it to a spirituality to heal you, is where Buddha actually traveled, was sick, and actually traveled to Sri Lanka to heal. And there is part of a shrine there that holds physically one of his bodily items there to this day. So Sri Lanka has been known for thousands of years as an island of holiness, of healing. And unfortunately, it was in a civil war for close to 50 years, a brutal civil war going on. So all the coastal ships around the country were not allowed to go out. They were just attacked and feared. So really the intercoastal fishing was suspended. So off the coast, literally when the Civil War ended, the fish were dying of old age right off the coast because no one had been catching them. So I tasted this tuna when I was in Sri Lanka, and the it was so delicious. And I'm like, why is this? And he took me out on the boat, and we went way out, and he showed me that there.
Well, hold on. Before you talk about how it is, this is what I was interested in. Talk about how tuna is normally caught and the problems with the two methods, which I think will lead to this, and it'll transition us and make more sense.
So I was just getting into that. So mostly tuna is caught by nets and long lines of small hooks. And when you catch tuna by nets, what happens is of course dolphins and everything gets caught in the nets, but they're struggling. They're realizing they're dying, and so any natural creature, when it feels it's dying, it releases enzymes, it releases different components in your body to stop the shock of death. And what that does, those chemicals then pollute your muscles, pollute everything within fish and human beings. So
and the same thing with the long lines when they're fighting to get in when you're trying to reel them in.
So what this company does ecologically, they have the hooks.
So I call it eco shock. Here it comes.
And then the hooks are larger, so smaller tuna cannot get its mouth around. But when the large tuna grabs it, a magnet goes down and shocks and kills them before they start struggling to their death. So when you have an immediate death, those chemicals aren't released, and that juicy piece of flesh is naturally preserved.
Yeah.
And there is a difference, and I was selling it to the top restaurants of the world. Charles Phan won the James Beard Award as the best restaurant in the United States and the best chef. I was selling directly to him his tuna.
Yeah.
So I think where's my James Beard Award?
That's what I joke, though, because eco
Here's
shock.
a real case example. I've had 40 products in Trader Joe's over the last 8 years. I've traveled with the head buyers of Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, Costco, Walmart, all over the world. Case in point, I had containers of dates from Tunisia that were shipped up to Trader Joe's. I had 5 containers ready to go on the water. When the container hit, it was fumigated. So you have the FDA requires you to fumigate dates because they don't want any invasive species, bugs or things to come into the country. It was totally fumigated. When it entered the United States, that container sat there for 2 weeks before it was inspected. Anything could have crawled in that container. It's not a total sealed container at that point because they broke the seal, they looked in, and then it went to secondary inspection. It's in part of the area where there's other containers as well.
Yeah.
So they saw one pallet with bugs on the one pallet. Trader Joe's rejected not only that container, they rejected all 5. I lost about $600,000 and Trader Joe's could care less.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Now, if that had blockchain and fumigation sensors as well as bug sensors in there that could register this, I would have been able to see the whole entire thing.
Right, or you would have known and been able to get in a lot quicker.
I would have known and blamed the U.S. federal government for their shortcomings, which it was. So I will be attending China's largest agricultural trade show here at the end of September. And the situation with beef is this. I was in Wyoming because that is truly, to me, the best state for beef in the United States. Why? It's truly grass-fed, all right?
And water, from what you said.
And when you think about it, everyone's like, oh, what are these cattle eating? Well, have you ever thought about what are they drinking?
Yeah.
What if you as a human being had delicious, steak or the best vegetables from, the Garden of Eden, but yet you were drinking fracking water? How would you feel? Okay? The cattle that are basically in Texas that are held by a company called XL, which is essentially Cargill. They control the largest slaughterhouses in the U.S. They're feeding the cattle corn that they grow that's all GMO because cattle stomachs cannot handle corn. They were not meant to eat corn. Their stomachs are all cut up, so they're bleeding. They have to be injected with hormones, and they have to also be injected with antibiotics to stop the infections and the bleedings of their stomach. That's the problem. I don't want to eat that.
Yeah.
You don't know where your meat is coming from. You should know. And Wyoming, I've been all over. I participated in the humane branding. They actually have names for these cattle. I've been to the Lockhart Ranch. I've been to Senator Ogden's ranch, how they're free range and they eat grass, and the humaneness of what's going on with no antibiotics, no hormones needs to be consumed if you decide to eat meat.
Okay. He's amazing at not only figuring his way out around these countries, but has been doing it for a long, long time. So appreciate your coming in today. John is down as well on the Groove Radio podcast station. It's called The Truth in Food. You can find him on iTunes. Again, thank you for joining.